The year was 1887, a time when the great, thundering herds were ghosts and the treaties were ink-stained lies. On the brittle plains of the Dakota Territory, the land itself held its breath, scarred and subdued. For Chayton, a man who had once been a war chief of the Lakota, this silence was the loudest sound. It was the sound of absence, the echo of a world that was no more. His authority, once as vast as the sky, had shrunk to the confines of a small, isolated lodge and the respect of the few who remembered the man he had been. Grief was a stone he carried in his chest, a weight for the wife and son the coughing sickness had claimed during a winter that had stolen more than just the warmth from the air. He lived with their memory, in the same way he lived with the rationing and the barbed wire fences that carved up the sacred earth. His days were a ritual of survival, a monotonous cycle of checking his few snares, tending to his 2 aging horses, and staring into a fire that offered heat but no comfort. He was a monument to a vanquished age, weathered and silent, his spirit banked like coals under a thick layer of ash. His isolation was a choice, a fortress built against a world that no longer had a place for him. He journeyed to the raw, wind-scoured settlement of promise only when necessity demanded it, when his supply of flour or salt ran thin. The town was a festering sore on the prairie, populated by hard-faced men with suspicious eyes and women whose gazes slid past him as if he were part of the landscape, a rock or a dead tree. He endured their palpable disdain, the thick air of prejudice, with a stoicism that was often mistaken for arrogance. He traded his finely tanned deer hides, spoke only the few English words required for the transaction, and left as quickly as he could, eager to return to the solace of his own quiet emptiness. On a blistering day in late summer, the dust of promise clung to the air like a shroud. Chayton had concluded his business at the general store, the meager supplies wrapped in a canvas bundle. As he moved toward his horse, a sight in the center of the dusty main street snagged his attention and held it fast. A boy, no older than 7 or 8 winters, was tied to a hitching post. He was a scarecrow of a child, all sharp angles and bones beneath a layer of grime that was streaked with the tracks of old tears. His hair was a matted thatch of sun-bleached brown, and his bare feet were calloused and bloody. Around his thin neck, hung by a piece of rough twine, was a crude wooden sign. Scrawled on it in charcoal was a single, brutal word: bites. The townsfolk passed him by without a second glance. A few men loitering outside the saloon gestured toward the boy and laughed, their voices coarse and cruel. The child endured it all with a stillness that was unnatural. He did not cry or plead. He simply stood, his small jaw set, and stared back at the world with an expression of such ferocious, unyielding defiance that it struck Chayton with the force of a physical blow. In those narrowed blue eyes, he saw not a broken victim, but a cornered wolf pup, ready to fight to its last breath. It was a spirit he recognized. It was the fire that had once burned in the hearts of his own warriors, the refusal to surrender even when all was lost. That spark of untamed life, flickering in this tormented, forsaken child, was the first thing that had truly pierced Chayton's armor of grief in years. The stone in his chest shifted, not with pity, but with a profound, unsettling jolt of recognition. He stopped, his hand resting on his horse's flank, and watched the boy who refused to be broken. The coals of his own spirit stirred, a faint warmth in the cold emptiness. A large, heavy-set man with a florid face and a stained waistcoat stepped out of the saloon. This was Garrett Vance, the owner, a man whose presence soured the air around him. He sauntered over to the boy, prodding his shoulder with the toe of his boot. "Still got some fight in you, have you, you little rat?" Vance sneered. The boy flinched, but did not make a sound, his glare intensifying. Chayton's gaze moved from the boy to Vance, his face an impassive mask that betrayed none of the disturbance roiling within him. He had seen men like Vance before, men who derived their strength from the weakness of others. He untied the canvas bundle from his saddle and walked slowly, deliberately, toward the center of the street. His approach did not go unnoticed. The laughter from the saloon porch faltered. The very sight of Chayton, straight-backed, his long greying hair braided with leather, his buckskins worn and old but impeccably cared for, was a quiet rebuke to the town's shabby cruelty. He moved with a purpose that made people uneasy. He stopped a few feet from Vance, his dark eyes fixed not on the man, but on the boy. He felt the child's fierce gaze transfer to him, sizing him up, full of suspicion and fear. Chayton said nothing. He reached into a small pouch at his belt and drew out $3 silver, coins he had been saving for a new axe head. He held them out on his open palm. Vance stared at the coins, then at Chayton, a slow, contemptuous smile spreading across his face. "What's this? You want to buy the mutt? He ain't worth 3 cents, let alone $3. His cronies on the porch roared with laughter. Chayton did not smile. His voice, when it came, was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. "He is not for you to keep." It was not a question or a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. The sheer, unshakable certainty in Chayton's tone seemed to momentarily unnerve Vance. He looked from the stoic Lakota man to the feral boy and back again. The idea was absurd, laughable. A savage buying a white orphan. The story would be told in his saloon for weeks. Finding the situation more amusing than threatening, he shrugged. "Fine, take him," Vance declared with a grand, mocking gesture. "He's more your kind than ours anyway. Wild thing." Chayton closed his hand around the coins and let them fall into the dust at Vance's feet. He ignored the man completely now, turning his full attention to the boy. He pulled a long-bladed knife from its sheath at his back. The boy gasped and shrank back against the post, his eyes wide with terror, convinced his end had come. The men on the porch chuckled, anticipating a show. But Chayton's movements were slow, measured. He knelt, bringing himself down to the child's level. He did not reach for the boy, but for the thick rope that bound his wrists to the wooden post. With a single fluid slice, he severed the cord. He then cut the twine holding the sign and tossed it aside. As the boy's hands came free, his terror exploded into action. He lunged, his head down, and tried to sink his teeth into Chayton's arm. It was the desperate, instinctual act of a creature who knew only violence. Chayton was ready for it. He shifted his arm slightly, and the boy's teeth grazed the thick buckskin of his sleeve. He did not recoil or strike back. He simply held his ground, a rock in the face of a tiny, furious storm. He captured the boy's thin shoulders in his large, gentle hands, holding him steady. He looked into the child's terrified eyes and saw the raw panic within. For a long moment, they stayed like that, a tableau of silent confrontation. Then Chayton let him go. He stood, turned his back on the gawking townsfolk, and walked to his horse. He untied a heavy wool blanket from his saddle roll and returned. Without a word, he wrapped the blanket around the boy's trembling frame, enclosing him in its warmth and scent of sage and leather. He lifted the child, who was as light as a bundle of dry sticks, and set him on the front of his saddle. The boy went rigid, every muscle tensed for a fight or flight that his exhausted body could not sustain. Chayton swung up behind him, his presence a solid wall at the boy's back. He gathered the reins, turned his horse away from the town of promise, and rode out into the vast, open silence of the plains, leaving the silver dollars glinting in the dust. The journey back to Chayton's lodge was measured by the rhythmic plodding of the horse's hooves and the vast, indifferent sky overhead. The boy, held securely between Chayton's arms, remained as stiff and unyielding as a wooden doll. He did not speak, did not move, barely seemed to breathe. Chayton matched his silence. He knew that words would be useless, mere noise against the boy's wall of terror and mistrust. Instead, he offered the quiet language of the land, the whisper of the wind through the dry grass, the steady warmth of his own body, the gentle, swaying gait of the horse. He let these things be his introduction, a stark contrast to the shouting and cruelty of the town. They arrived as the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Chayton's lodge was a simple, sturdy structure of sod and timber, built low against the earth for protection from the relentless wind. It was not a tipi from his past, but a home for his present reality. Smoke curled from a hole in the roof, a sign of the embers he kept carefully banked. He dismounted and gently lifted the boy down. The child's feet touched the ground and he immediately scrambled back, putting distance between them, his eyes darting around as if seeking an escape route. The wool blanket fell from his shoulders, pooling at his feet. Chayton let him be. He unsaddled his horse, rubbing the animal down with practiced, soothing strokes before setting it out to graze with its companion. Every movement was slow, deliberate, a lesson in peace for the wild thing watching him. Inside, the lodge was sparse and clean. A fire pit in the center held glowing coals. Furs were piled neatly for sleeping, and a few pots and tools hung from the wooden supports. Chayton added a few sticks to the fire, coaxing it back to a gentle flame. He took a piece of dried venison from a pouch and set it on a flat stone near the heat to warm. He filled a wooden bowl with water from a barrel and placed it, along with the meat, on the floor near where the boy stood huddled by the door. Then he sat down on his own furs across the fire and began to mend a piece of tack, his hands moving with an old familiar rhythm. He did not look at the boy. He did not speak to him. He simply created a space of safety and offered sustenance, leaving the choice entirely to the child. For a long time, nothing happened. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of Chayton's all through the leather. Finally, driven by a hunger that must have been a constant, gnawing pain, the boy crept forward. He snatched the piece of venison and retreated to his corner, devouring it with a ravenous animal desperation. He drank the water in great, gulping swallows. When he was finished, he wiped his mouth on the back of his filthy hand and resumed his vigil, his wide, wary eyes tracking Chayton's every move. This became their pattern for days. Chayton would go about his quiet routine, stending the horses, checking his snares, preparing his simple meal sand. The boy would watch. He was a small, silent shadow flitting at the edges of Chayton's life. He never spoke. He ate what was offered, but would not come close. Chayton gave him the space he so clearly needed, understanding that trust, like a wild colt, could not be rushed or cornered. It had to approach of its own accord. One afternoon, Chayton sat outside, carving a piece of cottonwood. The boy watched from the doorway of the lodge. Chayton finished the small figure of a horse, smoothing its edges with his thumb. Without looking up, he took another piece of wood and his smaller, simpler knife and placed them on the ground halfway between them. He went back to his own carving, as if he had forgotten they were there. It took an hour, but eventually the boy crept out, snatched the wood and the knife, and scurried back to his spot. He began to carve, his brow furrowed in concentration. His first attempts were clumsy, but he was patient, persistent. The simple, focused task seemed to drain some of the frantic energy from him. The first crack in the boy's shell of silence came not from a word, but from a sound. A week after his arrival, a piercing cry tore through the deep quiet of the night. Chayton was awake in an instant, his hand reaching for the knife he kept beside his furs. He rose and went to the boy's sleeping pile. The child was thrashing, caught in the grips of a nightmare, his small hands batting at unseen terrors. Chayton did not touch him. He did not speak. He simply sat on the packed earth floor a few feet away, a solid, immovable presence in the flickering firelight. He waited. His stillness was a quiet anchor in the boy's turbulent dreams. Gradually, the thrashing subsided, and the panicked whimpers faded into ragged breaths. The boy's eyes fluttered open, slick with tears and fear. He saw Chayton sitting there, and for a moment, panic flared again. But Chayton did not move, did not threaten. He just sat, his expression unreadable but calm. The boy's breathing evened out, and he watched Chayton until his heavy eyelids drifted shut once more. The next evening, as they ate their meal in the usual silence, the boy looked across the fire at Chayton. His voice, when it finally emerged, was a dry, rasping whisper, cracked from disuse. "What's your name?" Chayton looked up, surprised by the direct question. He met the boy's gaze and held it. "I am called Chayton." The boy absorbed this, mulling it over. He took another bite of roasted rabbit. Then he spoke again, his voice a fraction stronger. "My name is Arthur." "Arthur," Chayton repeated softly. The name felt foreign in his lodge, a piece of the world he had left behind. He nodded slowly. "It is good to know your name." The dam of silence had been broken. The trickle of words did not become a flood, but the quiet between them was different now. It was no longer a space of suspicion and distance, but one of growing comfort. Arthur began to follow Chayton on his daily rounds, at first from a distance, then walking just a few steps behind him. Chayton started to teach him, not with lectures, but with gestures and demonstration. He showed Arthur how to read the tracks of a jackrabbit in the dust, how to find the north by the moss on a rock, how to listen to the language of the birds to know when a predator was near. Arthur was a quick and eager learner. The skills gave him a sense of purpose, a way to interact with the world that was not about pain or survival, but about knowledge and competence. Chayton saw the intelligence in his eyes, the way his mind worked to solve the puzzles of the natural world. He began to see past the fierceness and the fear to the wounded child beneath, a boy who had been starved of everything, especially kindness. One day, as they were grooming the horses, Chayton spoke a word in his own language, Tashunka. He laid a hand on the flank of his older horse. He then looked at the boy. "Tashunka," he said again, this time with a nod toward Arthur. It meant his horse, a name of value, of connection. Arthur did not understand the word, but he understood the tone. He understood the way Chayton looked at him when he said it. It was not a brand like the sign in the town. It was a gift. He did not have the words to ask what it meant, but he held it close, a secret, warmer name. The hardened prejudice he had been taught about the savages on the reservation crumbled into dust, replaced by the reality of this quiet, patient man who had shown him nothing but a strange, gruff sort of gentleness. Chayton, in turn, found that the act of teaching, of protecting, was stirring the embers of his own heart. The ghost of his first son still walked with him, but now he was not alone. There was a small, living boy walking beside him. The fragile piece they had built was as delicate as a spider's web, and just as easily torn. The world beyond Chayton's small patch of land had not forgotten them. Garrett Vance had not seen the transaction as the end of the matter. He had allowed Chayton to take the boy because it was amusing, a temporary solution to a nuisance. But Arthur was more than just a nuisance. The boy's parents, homesteaders who had died of fever the previous year, had owned a small, scrabbled-out plot of land bordering the creek. It was worthless to most, but Vance knew the railroad was surveying a new spur line, and that creekside land would soon be vital. The deed was tied to the boy, their only child. Vance's plan had been simple: to break Arthur's spirit completely, to terrorize him into signing away his inheritance with a thumbprint on a document he couldn't read. When weeks passed and the boy didn't reappear, starved and begging at the edge of town, Vance grew agitated. Word reached him from a nervous trader that the orphan was not only alive but looked cared for. That he was living with the old Lakota man, learning his ways. Vance saw his plan slipping through his fingers. He imagined the boy confiding in his new protector, the savage getting ideas. He could not allow it. The boy had to be brought back, and the Indian needed to be taught a lesson about interfering in white men's affairs. One afternoon, as Chayton and Arthur were checking a line of snares near the ridge overlooking their hollow, Arthur suddenly froze. He pointed a thin finger toward the east. Chayton's eyes followed, and he saw them three riders kicking up a plume of dust against the horizon. They were still miles away, but their direction was unmistakable. They were heading straight for his lodge. A cold knot formed in Chayton's stomach. He knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, who they were and why they were coming. He looked at Arthur. The boy's face had gone pale, the old haunted terror returning to his eyes. He recognized the threat before he could even make out the figures. "They are coming for me," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. "They will not take you," Chayton said. The words were quiet, but they held the weight of an iron promise. The ashes that had banked his spirit for so long were swept away by a sudden, hot gust of protective fury. This was no longer just about a lonely man finding a purpose. It was about a father defending his son. He put a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Go to the lodge. Bar the door from the inside. Do not open it for any voice but mine." He pushed a small bundle into the boy's Hansa waterskin and a piece of dried meat. "If I do not return by sunrise, take the high path through the rocks to the west. Follow it until you reach the camp of Black Moon. Tell them you are Tashunka, the son of Chayton. They will help you." Arthur's eyes were wide with fear, not just for himself, but for Chayton. He shook his head, a small, desperate gesture. "No. You will do as I say." Chayton's voice was stern, the voice of a chief, leaving no room for argument. "Now, run." Arthur hesitated for another heartbeat, then turned and ran, his small legs pumping as he scrambled down the slope toward the safety of the lodge. Chayton watched him go before turning his gaze back to the approaching riders. He did not go to the lodge for his rifle. He did not seek cover. He simply stood on the ridge, a solitary, unmoving figure against the vast, empty sky, and waited. He would meet them on his own terms, on the land that knew him. Garrett Vance and his 2 hired thugs reined in their horses at the base of the ridge. They saw the lone figure standing above them, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Vance smirked, feeling the power of his position. 3 armed white men against 1 old Indian. The odds were, in his mind, decisively in his favor. "Chayton," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the unnerving quiet. "We know you have the boy. Send him out. We're here to take him back to civilization, where he belongs." Chayton remained silent, his stillness more imposing than any threat. He watched them, his eyes narrowed, reading their intentions in the way they sat their horses, the way their hands hovered near their pistols. He was not just a man, he was a warrior who had faced cavalry charges. These were just loud, clumsy bullies. "Don't play dumb with me, you heathen," Vance shouted, his bravado fraying at the edges in the face of Chayton's implacable calm. "We ain't leaving without him." He spurred his horse a few steps up the slope, his cronies following his lead. From the corner of his eye, Chayton saw a flicker of movement near the lodge below. The door, which should have been barred, creaked open. Arthur slipped out. He was supposed to be hiding, supposed to be safe, but instead of cowering, the boy began to climb the slope toward Chayton, his small face set with a terrifying, familiar defiance. He was not running from his monsters anymore. He was running to stand with the man who had faced them for him. Chayton's heart seized. The boy's courage was a beautiful, terrible thing. It changed everything. This was no longer a fight he could wage alone on the ridge. He had to protect the child who was now climbing into the heart of the danger. He turned and strode down the hill, meeting Arthur halfway. He put a hand on his back, feeling the boy's small, trembling body, and guided him the rest of the way down, until they stood on the flat ground before the 3 riders. Arthur, in a gesture of pure, unthinking trust, reached out and clutched a handful of Chayton's buckskin shirt, anchoring himself to the only safety he had ever known. Vance's face contorted with rage when he saw the boy's blatant act of allegiance. "Look at that," he spat. "Got him brainwashed already. Get away from him, boy." Arthur pressed closer to Chayton's leg. "I told you," Vance snarled, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "He's coming with us." He pulled the gun from its holster. The world seemed to slow down. Chayton saw the glint of the sun on the pistol's barrel, the cruel twist of Vance's mouth, the terror and resolve warring in Arthur's eyes. The instincts of a lifetime, the skills of a war chief that had lain dormant for years, surged through him. Before Vance could fully raise the weapon, Chayton moved. He was not a man in his 50s, he was a blur of calculated motion. In one fluid movement, he shoved Arthur behind him and snatched up a rock from the ground. It was not a large rock, but it was heavy and fit his hand perfectly. He did not throw it at Vance. He hurled it with incredible force and pinpoint accuracy at the face of the horse belonging to the man on Vance's right. The horse screamed in pain and terror, rearing violently. It threw its rider, a lanky man who hit the ground with a sickening thud. The animal bolted, blind with panic, crashing into Vance's own mount. Vance's horse shied, throwing off his aim. The pistol discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet whining harmlessly into the sky. In that moment of chaos, Chayton closed the distance. He ignored the third man, who was fumbling to draw his own weapon, and launched himself at Vance. He did not use a knife or a gun. He used his body, a weapon of pure, focused intent. He slammed his shoulder into Vance's side, knocking the bigger man clean out of his saddle. Vance landed hard, the air driven from his lungs in a great whoosh. Chayton was on him in an instant, one hand pinning Vance's gun arm to the ground, the other pressing the blade of his old knife against the soft flesh of the man's throat. "He stays," Chayton said, his voice a low, lethal growl. The fight was over. It had lasted less than 10 seconds. The third man, seeing his boss helpless and his companion unconscious, stared in wide-eyed shock. He raised his hand slowly, dropping his pistol into the dust. He had come expecting to bully an old Indian. He had found something else entirely. Chayton pressed the knife just enough to draw a single bead of blood on Vance's throat. "You will not return. This land is not for you. The boy is not for you. He is my son." He let the words hang in the air, a declaration that was also a sentence. He held Vance's terrified gaze until he saw the man's arrogant resolve shatter completely, replaced by pure animal fear. Then he stood up, pulling the knife away. He kicked Vance's pistol far out of reach. He looked at the third man. "Take them and go." The man scrambled from his horse, helped the groaning Vance to his feet, and began the clumsy process of rousing their fallen companion. Chayton stood over them, a silent sentinel, until they had mounted their horses and retreated, not with the swagger of bullies, but with the frantic haste of defeated men. He watched them until they were nothing more than a small, shamed smudge of dust on the horizon. The silence that fell in the wake of their departure was profound. It was not the empty silence of loneliness, but the deep, resonant silence of victory and peace. The land itself seemed to exhale, settling back into its quiet rhythms. Chayton turned and looked at Arthur. The boy was staring at him, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of awe, terror, and overwhelming relief. The fierce, defiant child was gone, replaced by a boy who had just seen his world saved. Chayton's body ached. A long, shallow cut from a flailing spur on Vance's boot stung his forearm. He walked back toward the lodge on weary legs, the adrenaline draining away, leaving behind the bone-deep tiredness of his years. He sat heavily on the bench outside the door, the events of the last few minutes washing over him. A moment later, Arthur appeared in the doorway. He held a strip of clean cloth and the small wooden bowl filled with water. He approached Chayton without a word, his movements hesitant but determined. He knelt before him and began to gently, carefully, clean the cut on Chayton's arm. The simple, tender act was more powerful than any words could ever be. It was an acknowledgement, a thank you, a promise. It was the gesture of a son caring for his father. Chayton watched the boy's small, concentrating face and felt the last of the ice around his heart melt away. The gaping wound of his past grief, the loss of his first family, did not disappear, but it no longer felt like a void. It felt like a space that had made room for this new, unexpected, and fiercely won love. Their life resumed, but its foundation was now forged in fire and loyalty. It was unshakable. Arthur Tashunka, as he now preferred to be called, was no longer a silent shadow. His laughter, at first a startling sound in the quiet hollow, became a regular music. He asked Chayton one evening, as they watched the stars emerge in the velvet sky, what his Lakota name truly meant. Tashunka, Chayton explained, his voice soft. It means his horse. A horse is a companion, a helper. It carries you. It is a part of your spirit. You are Tashunka, because you carry my spirit forward. A slow, brilliant smile spread across the boy's face, the first true, unclouded smile Chayton had ever seen from him. He was no longer Arthur, the boy who bites, the orphan tied to a post. He was Tashunka, son of Chayton. He had a place, he had a name, he belonged. A few weeks later, Chayton took the boy to a high, windswept bluff that overlooked the rolling plains. It was a sacred place, a place he had always gone to speak to the spirits of his wife and son. He had never brought another living soul there. They sat together on the warm rock, the wind whispering secrets through the sparse grasses. Chayton did not speak of the ones he had lost. He did not have to. Instead, he pointed to the east, to the faint, dark line of the Black Hills. There, he said, that was the heart of our world. He spoke of the buffalo, of the great circles of life, of a time when his people were as free as the eagles that circled above them. He shared his past not as a lament for what was gone, but as a legacy for the boy who sat beside him. As the sun bled across the horizon, casting them in a golden light, Chayton looked at the boy. He saw the fierce spirit he had first recognized in the dusty street of promise, but now it was tempered with trust and illuminated by love. A discarded white orphan and a grieving Lakota chief, two souls cast out by their respective worlds, had found in each other what both had lost. On the fractured edge of a dying frontier, under the vast and watchful sky, they had forged a family. They had built a home.